Learning a language is a fundamental part of the degree in theology and religion, and can be an optional part of other degrees. It is very different from the other kinds of subjects you will study in theology, however. This video introduces some elements of the language learning that goes on through the medium of my favourite language, ancient Greek. In this talk, I will cover some of the basics about what we learn and how we learn it, applying this to a case study of the prodigal son in Luke 15, before finishing with a few common questions and concerns. We start off with the basics. Students need to learn the alphabet. They learn to read and write the letters. Learning to read and write a new language can feel a bit like going back to primary school. Greek classes are a lot more interactive than you might expect. You're working in small groups, often around 6 to 8 students, from a range of colleges, and students like the camaraderie that this brings. It's very different to the rest of your tutorial and lecture teaching. Getting to grips with the alphabet happens much more quickly than students expect, though, and we can start learning about how the language works, and then reading the texts themselves. In early classes, we use a textbook, working through explanations of grammatical material and practice exercises. Students get weekly short homeworks and regular short tests. These don't count towards your grade, but do help me work out how things are going and what we need to do to help individual students make better progress. One of the earliest topics we cover is prepositions. Prepositions are words which help to explain relationships between other words. There are lots in Greek. We start off with a basic chart in the textbook. This is quite decontextualised and intimidating though, and the point of learning Greek is to understand it in action. We can use activities like creating our own storyboards with soft toys to show prepositions in action. In this example, we used 3 small soft toys and a small cardboard box to model going towards a box, which was supposed to be a temple, heading into the box in order, and finally being statically in the box. Students create storyboards like this, and that helps give them a personal way of remembering the Greek that they're learning. Then we can move on to reading prepositions in a text, thinking about how they help us to understand relationships in the Bible. We start reading unadapted Greek in term 2. A class might involve students preparing a bit of text in advance, with support from vocab lists and a support workbook. In class, we would check everyone understood the text, discuss points of interest, and compare different translations. We read over 200 verses and think about themes such as linguistic style, translation theory, textual criticism, and the reception of the text. What follows is a discussion of this with reference to the prodigal son in Luke. First of all, a basic translation of this, and I'll highlight the words as I translate them. And he used to want to be fed from the husks which the pigs would eat, yet nobody would give him any. Coming to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough to eat? Yet I am dying of hunger here. I shall get up and go to my father, and I shall say to him, 'Father, I have done wrong against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was deeply moved. He ran down to him and flung his arms around his neck and kissed him. His son said to him, 'Father, I have done wrong against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.'" What might we say about this? We can see 2 of those same prepositions I covered. First of all, you have pros, twice. In the picture earlier, we saw that pros meant towards. Here you can see that it has a movement sense, but you probably only want to say to in English. That's a fairly minor change. Ace is trickier. We have it in verse 18, and then again in verse 21. Here it has something to do with how you wrong against heaven. That use of ace to mean against is something we see frequently in the New Testament. It shows us how ace carries a kind of adversative sense, but also how tricky it is to pin down relationships precisely in translation, as different languages express them differently. In fact, I used against for both ace and the following preposition, enopeion. Enopeion means something along the lines of before the face of. It is used 94 times in the New Testament. While it does exist in classical Greek, it is not at all common. It isn't used at all in my favourite author, Sophocles, for example. What it does do is help pick up some of the ways of talking about being in the presence of God which we find in the Hebrew of the Old Testament. Another thing we have to look at, then, is how the Greek of the New Testament engages with the Semitic background of the Old Testament and the Jewish people. Another preposition in this passage which causes problems is epi. It can be followed by each of the three cases in Greek which follow prepositions, the accusative, genitive and dative. Its meaning changes slightly with each, and students learn to be sensitive readers of Greek to work through these issues. Even once they have made a careful decision, however, context can change this. Here we have the father falling on his son's neck. I've translated it as flung his arms around his neck because I wanted to use an idiom in English which captured the energetic physical action. If we left it as fell on his neck, then we'd have something much more dangerous than tender. This passage brings up a number of further interesting translation questions. Verse 20 opens with the word kai. A dictionary entry for this would read and. How often, however, are we told not to start English sentences with and? Kai is also what we could call a discourse marker, though. Mark starts almost every sentence with it, where it is code for this sentence follows on from the last one with no abrupt change. Here you can see it signified the son doing what he said he would do. Can we mark that in English? We might use something like so to show the causal relationship between the two phrases. Thinking through the function of words like this is a different approach to translation to the more jigsaw puzzle approach of a more formal translation. Both have a role to play in the work we do, and one thing we think about is how differences of translation approach work and how they affect interpretation. My final favourite example from this passage is S blankness there. I've translated it as deeply moved. It's hard to find something appropriate, but that's a dreadful translation. Your splankna are your guts, your inner organs. This word makes a verb out of them and puts it in the passive so that something is being done to them. It might be better translated gut-wrenched. There are 6 uses of this particular word in this particular form in the New Testament. One is here, another when the Samaritan sees the injured man lying on the road in Luke 10. Elsewhere, it is used when Jesus sees someone suffering. It's a visceral word that shows us how strong an emotion suffering can provoke, whether in a parable or in narrative. It tells us something about the emotional life of the New Testament, including the physicality of Jesus' response to situations. You might have noticed how repetitive this passage is too. This is often the case with stories, as commands are carried out, etc. In this case, however, it also brings up an issue of textual criticism. When we say we are translating the original Greek, what do we mean? We don't have Luke's own handwritten text. What we have are thousands of bits of copies done over thousands of years. One thing we also have to think about, then, is how the text has changed over that time and what text we actually want to read. We therefore read the Greek for ourselves, thinking about how the text emerged and various factors about Greek which we need to consider when reading it. We might then compare different translations to help us understand more about how the process of translation affects interpretation. This might even include considering images. This story has generated many images, particularly cartoon strip type ones. Moving from text to image is itself another form of translation. In considering these two very different images, we might want to consider factors such as which moments from the story are chosen. Are they given the same space and weight as the Greek text? How do stylistic elements of the Greek get changed in visual representation? So translation and reading Greek is far more than learning lists of words and charts of endings, and hopefully quite a satisfying task for students to engage in. Students are often a bit concerned, particularly because Greek can seem really hard. Learning a language is always going to be a challenge. We know that though, and many people will have had very little prior language experience, so we are happy to work you through from the start. If you find things challenging, we'll come up with ways to help. That's a benefit of the small group teaching style. There is a lot to learn. I often say to students that studying Greek for prelims is harder than taking the exam itself at the end of the first year. You cover a lot of grammatical material and need to learn about 600 words of vocab. But because you're using this to read meaningful text, it isn't just a question of rote learning. And we have many suggestions of techniques to help too. So how can you prepare? The basic answer is very little. We assume you're a beginner, so are quite happy to take you from the very start of the language. If you would like to prepare the ground a bit, you could do things such as learn the alphabet. There are great resources available through websites like the Open University, or you can look at testing apps like Memrise. If you're worried about or particularly interested in grammar, then there are books and websites which will help lay foundations in English grammar for those going to study Greek. You can just think more broadly, though, about the role of language and translation in your daily life. Where do you see translation going on? It might even be looking on the side of a food packet and seeing if you can puzzle out some of the multiple translations of ingredients and instructions that you find there. Look up the archives on the Bodleian's exhibition on translation. What answers do you have to the questions they pose? Here are a few images that illustrate the kind of things I've been talking about. If you want more ideas, you're very welcome to get in touch with me, and I will give you some ideas that suit your personal interests and the context in which you find yourself. Otherwise, I'd summarise by saying learning Greek is a fantastic part of the degree that opens your eyes to reading the text in a new way that complements everything else you're doing in the degree, but is a different and satisfying challenge in its own right.